The autumn winds of 2023 carried more than just fallen leaves through the corridors of Buckingham Palace. They brought whispers of tension, fragments of conversations that should have remained private, and the echoes of a decision that would fracture relationships within the royal circle forever. King Charles III, newly crowned and still adjusting to the weight of his mother's legacy, found himself at the center of a family drama that would test every principle he had learned about duty, love, and the delicate balance between personal happiness and royal obligation. It began on a particularly gray Thursday morning in October. Charles sat in his private study, the same room where his mother had spent countless hours reviewing state papers and making decisions that shaped the Commonwealth. The irony was not lost on him that he would soon make a choice that would echo through the palace walls for months to come. The morning light filtered through heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the Persian rug that had been a gift from the Shah of Iran decades earlier. Camilla entered the room with her characteristic grace, carrying a silver tray with Earl Grey tea and digestive biscuits. Her face bore the careful composure that had taken her years to perfect, but Charles could read the subtle signs of distress in the way she held her shoulders slightly too high and the almost imperceptible tremor in her hands as she set down the china cups. "The children have been calling again," she said quietly, settling into the leather chair across from his mahogany desk. The children she referred to were not children at all, but her adult son Tom Parker Bowles and daughter Laura Lopez, both well into their 40s and established in their own right. Tom had carved out a successful career as a food critic and author, while Laura had built a reputation as a talented art curator. Both had been patient and understanding during the long years when their mother's relationship with Charles had been scrutinized, criticized, and eventually accepted by the British public. Charles lifted his eyes from the correspondence he had been reviewing, letters from Commonwealth leaders congratulating him on various state functions. His expression remained neutral, but something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The decision he had been wrestling with for weeks suddenly crystallized in his mind, and he knew there would be no turning back from what he was about to say. "I've given this considerable thought, my dear," he began, his voice carrying the measured tone that had become second nature during decades of public speaking. "The dynamics of our situation have become increasingly complex since the coronation. The palace protocols, the public expectations, the historical precedents, they all point toward a necessary adjustment in our approach to family integration." Camilla felt her breath catch in her throat. She had anticipated this conversation for months, dreading it while simultaneously knowing it was inevitable. The signs had been subtle but unmistakable. The gradual reduction in invitations extended to Tom and Laura for official functions, the careful editing of guest lists for state dinners, the diplomatic explanations offered to explain their absence from family photographs that would be studied by historians for generations to come. The transformation in Charles since becoming king had been remarkable to witness. The man who had once been criticized for his indecisiveness had developed a steely resolve when it came to protecting the monarchy's reputation and ensuring its continued relevance in a rapidly changing world. The weight of centuries of tradition rested on his shoulders, and he wore that responsibility with an intensity that sometimes surprised even those closest to him. "The constitutional experts have been quite clear in their guidance," Charles continued, reaching for a leather-bound folder that contained weeks of research and consultation notes. "The precedents set by previous monarchs in similar situations suggest that a clear delineation between immediate royal family and extended connections serves the institution better in the long term. We must consider not just the present moment, but how these decisions will impact the monarchy 50 or even 100 years from now." The weight of those words settled between them like a physical presence in the room. Camilla had always understood that marrying Charles meant accepting certain limitations and sacrifices, but the reality of watching her children be systematically excluded from the life she had built with the man she loved was proving more painful than she had anticipated. She thought of the years they had all spent in limbo, waiting for public acceptance, weathering criticism and speculation, only to find that acceptance came with its own set of challenges and restrictions. Tom and Laura had never sought the spotlight that came with their mother's relationship with Charles. They had both worked diligently to maintain their own identities and careers, carefully avoiding any appearance of capitalizing on their connection to the royal family. Tom's restaurant reviews were respected in their own right. His cookbook sales reflected genuine expertise rather than celebrity endorsement. Laura's art exhibitions drew crowds because of her keen eye for emerging talent, not because of her family connections. Yet despite their efforts to remain independent, the palace machinery had begun to view them as potential complications in the carefully orchestrated presentation of the royal family to the public. Every photograph that included them required careful consideration. Every invitation extended to them meant one less space for a member of the traditional aristocracy or a representative from the Commonwealth nations that formed the foundation of Charles's reign. The decision had not come easily to Charles. He spent sleepless nights walking through the palace gardens, past the rose bushes that his mother had tended with such care, trying to reconcile his love for Camilla with his duty to the crown. He consulted with constitutional lawyers, historians, and even reached out quietly to monarchs from other European countries who had faced similar dilemmas in their own reigns. The advice he received was consistent and troubling. The most successful monarchies in the modern era were those that maintained clear boundaries around their core family unit. The Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian royal families had all implemented policies that limited the official roles and public presence of extended family members, focusing public attention and resources on direct heirs and their spouses. The British monarchy, with its global reach and complex constitutional role, required even more careful management of its public image. I need you to understand that this decision causes me considerable personal pain, Charles said, his voice softer now, tinged with the emotion he usually kept carefully controlled. Tom and Laura are remarkable individuals who have shown nothing but grace and discretion throughout this entire journey. My respect and affection for them has not diminished in any way. But the institution must come first, as it always has, as it always must. Camilla nodded slowly, understanding the logic even as her heart rebelled against it. She had spent decades learning to navigate the complex rules and expectations that governed royal life. She had transformed herself from a country woman who loved horses and gardening into a polished royal consort who could host state dinners and engage in diplomatic conversations with ease. But this felt different. This felt like a betrayal of the family bonds that had sustained her through the most difficult periods of her life. The silence that followed stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding about the sacrifice being demanded. Charles reached across the desk to take her hand, his fingers warm despite the autumn chill that seemed to permeate the ancient walls around them. In that gesture, she could feel both his love for her and his absolute commitment to the decision he had made. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted in the royal household came during the preparations for the annual Christmas celebrations at Sandringham. Lady Susan Hussey, one of the Queen Consort's most trusted ladies-in-waiting, noticed it while reviewing the guest accommodations list in her small office overlooking the estate's gardens. The names she expected to see were conspicuously absent, and when she discreetly inquired about the oversight, she was met with uncomfortable silence from the private secretary who had prepared the document. Tom Parker Bowles had been expecting the invitation that traditionally arrived in early November. For the past several years, since his mother's marriage to Charles, the Christmas gathering had become a treasured family tradition. His children had grown to love the expansive grounds of Sandringham, the organized chaos of present opening on Christmas Eve, and the sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. This year, as November turned to December with no invitation forthcoming, Tom began to understand that the subtle changes he had noticed throughout the autumn were part of a larger, more systematic exclusion. The realization hit him during a quiet evening in his London flat, surrounded by the familiar comforts of his book-lined study and the gentle hum of city traffic beyond his windows. He had been working on a review of a new restaurant in Notting Hill when his phone remained stubbornly silent. No call from the palace social secretary, no formal invitation delivered by messenger, no casual mention from his mother during their weekly telephone conversation about Christmas plans and gift suggestions. Laura Lopez experienced her own moment of clarity during a gallery opening in Chelsea, where she was showcasing the work of an emerging Scottish artist whose landscapes captured the raw beauty of the Highlands. As she moved through the crowd of art collectors and critics, making the small talk that was essential to her professional success, she found herself scanning the room automatically for the familiar faces of royal protection officers who had become a normal part of her public appearances. Their absence was subtle but unmistakable, and she understood that the security protocols that had been quietly extended to protect Charles's stepchildren had been just as quietly withdrawn. The emotional impact of this gradual exclusion was complicated by the fact that both Tom and Laura had always maintained a certain distance from royal life. They had careers and identities that existed independently of their mother's marriage, and they had worked hard to ensure that their professional success could not be attributed solely to their family connections. Yet the slow removal of their peripheral royal status felt like a rejection not just of them personally, but of the family unity that had been so carefully constructed over years of patient public relations work. Charles himself was not immune to the emotional complexity of his decision. During his daily walks through the grounds of Clarence House, often accompanied only by his protection officers, and the rhythmic sound of his footsteps on gravel paths, he found himself remembering moments when Tom and Laura had been integral parts of family celebrations. He recalled Tom's dry humor during tense family dinners, his ability to defuse difficult moments with well-timed observations about food or current events. He remembered Laura's quiet intelligence, her thoughtful questions about art and history that had led to some of the most engaging conversations he had enjoyed in recent years. But these personal memories had to be weighed against the broader considerations that occupied his thoughts during the lonely hours of early morning when sleep eluded him. The monarchy was facing challenges that required unprecedented focus and unity of purpose. The public's relationship with the royal family had evolved dramatically since his mother's death, and every decision about inclusion or exclusion carried potential consequences that extended far beyond personal feelings. The constitutional experts who advised Charles had been unanimous in their recommendation that the royal family's public presence should be streamlined and focused on the direct line of succession. In an era of economic uncertainty and political instability, the monarchy needed to present itself as essential rather than decorative, purposeful rather than privileged. Every additional family member included in official functions represented another potential source of controversy or distraction from the core mission of serving as a symbol of national unity and continuity. Camilla found herself caught between two profound loyalties that seemed increasingly incompatible. Her devotion to Charles and her understanding of the pressures he faced as monarch made it impossible for her to challenge his decision directly. She had witnessed firsthand the weight of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders since the coronation, the way he approached every decision through the lens of institutional survival rather than personal preference. Yet her maternal instincts rebelled against the systematic exclusion of her children from the life she had built with the man she loved. She watched Tom struggle with feelings of rejection that he was too proud to express openly. Noticed the careful way Laura edited their conversations to avoid mentioning royal events or family gatherings that might create awkward silences. The family dinners at her private residence became exercises in diplomatic conversation, with everyone working to maintain normalcy while acknowledging a fundamental shift in their relationships. The palace staff, those dedicated professionals who had spent their careers serving the royal family, found themselves implementing policies that went against their natural inclinations toward inclusivity and family harmony. Private secretaries had to decline invitations on behalf of Tom and Laura without being able to provide satisfactory explanations. Security personnel had to adjust protection protocols that had been carefully developed to ensure the safety of all family members who might be targets because of their connection to the throne. Most painfully, the household staff who had grown fond of Camilla's children and grandchildren found themselves having to maintain professional distance from people they had come to regard as extended family members. The Christmas preparations that had once included excited discussions about gift preferences and dietary restrictions for Tom and Laura's families now proceeded with a notable absence of such considerations. The media, ever alert to changes in royal protocol and family dynamics, began to notice the absence of figures who had once been regular features in official photographs and event coverage. Royal correspondents, those seasoned journalists who had spent years learning to read the subtle signals embedded in palace announcements and guest lists, started to ask careful questions about the reduced public presence of the Queen Consort's children. The palace press office, led by professionals who had decades of experience managing royal family narratives, found themselves developing new strategies for addressing inquiries about Tom and Laura's absence from various functions. The official line emphasized the independent careers and busy professional lives of the Queen Consort's children, carefully avoiding any suggestion that their exclusion was the result of a deliberate policy decision. Behind the scenes, however, the emotional cost of maintaining this official narrative was becoming increasingly apparent. Camilla's private secretary noticed changes in the Queen Consort's mood and energy levels, subtle signs of stress that manifested in shorter tempers with staff, and longer periods of silence during official functions. Charles's closest advisors observed similar changes in the king's demeanor, a new rigidity in his approach to family matters that suggested he was working hard to suppress his natural impulses toward inclusivity and warmth. The ripple effects of the king's decision extended beyond the immediate family to encompass the broader network of relationships that had developed around Camilla's integration into royal life. Friends who had been accustomed to seeing Tom and Laura at various social functions found themselves editing their guest lists to avoid creating awkward situations. The country houses and social clubs where royal family members were regular visitors began to adjust their protocols to reflect new realities about who was considered part of the official royal circle. For Tom and Laura themselves, the challenge was not just emotional, but practical. Their professional lives had been carefully constructed to maintain independence from their mother's royal status. But that independence had been built on a foundation of subtle royal connections that were now being systematically removed. Restaurant owners who had hoped for royal patronage through Tom's reviews found their expectations quietly deflated. Art collectors who had been interested in Laura's exhibitions partly because of her family connections began to reassess their level of engagement. The cruel irony was that both of Camilla's children had always been scrupulously careful about maintaining appropriate boundaries around their royal connections. They had never exploited their position for commercial gain, never sought publicity through their relationship to the king, never made demands on the palace for favors or special treatment. Their exclusion was not the result of any inappropriate behavior or breach of protocol, but simply the consequence of a calculated decision about institutional priorities. As winter deepened and the Christmas season approached without the anticipated family celebrations, the silence that had characterized the initial decision began to feel more like a permanent condition than a temporary adjustment. The palace, that vast complex of buildings and traditions that had survived world wars, constitutional crises, and countless personal dramas, seemed to absorb this latest family trauma with the same impassive dignity it had maintained through centuries of royal history. But for the individuals caught within this institutional machinery, the silence was anything but peaceful. It was the sound of relationships being redefined, of family bonds being tested by forces beyond anyone's individual control, and of a new chapter beginning in the long, complex story of duty, love, and sacrifice that had always defined life within the British royal family. The transformation was subtle but inexorable, visible to those who knew how to read the signs embedded in official announcements, guest lists, and the careful choreography of royal public appearances. The family that had once presented itself as a successful example of modern blending was quietly, but definitively reorganizing itself around older, more traditional concepts of royal hierarchy and protocol. In the quiet moments between official duties, when Charles and Camilla found themselves alone together in the private apartments that had become their refuge from public scrutiny, the weight of these changes hung between them like an unspoken acknowledgement of the price that royal life continued to exact from those who chose to enter its privileged but constrained circle. The first public manifestation of the royal family's internal reorganization came during the annual Commonwealth Day service at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony, one of the most significant events in the royal calendar, traditionally showcased the unity and continuity of the monarchy while celebrating the diverse nations that formed the Commonwealth. This year, however, careful observers noticed subtle but significant changes in the composition of the royal party that walked down the Abbey's ancient nave. Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary, had spent weeks perfecting the seating arrangements and processional order for the service. Every detail had been scrutinized through the lens of protocol, precedence, and the carefully calibrated message that the palace wanted to convey about the monarchy's priorities and relationships. The absence of Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez from the guest list was not accidental, nor was it a simple oversight in the complex logistics of organizing a state occasion. Camilla walked beside Charles with her characteristic grace, her face composed in the expression of dignified attention that she had perfected over years of public appearances. But those who knew her well could detect subtle signs of the internal struggle she was experiencing. Her smile seemed more controlled than usual, her interactions with other members of the royal family slightly more formal. The easy familiarity that had once characterized her demeanor at family events had been replaced by something more guarded, more carefully managed. Archbishop Justin Welby, as he prepared to deliver the service's central address, was aware that he was speaking not just to the congregation gathered before him, but to a global audience that would analyze every word for insights into the monarchy's evolving role and character. His sermon touched on themes of unity, service, and the importance of family bonds that transcend political boundaries, themes that carried particular poignancy given the private struggles unfolding within the royal family itself. The television coverage of the service, broadcast to millions of viewers across the Commonwealth nations, followed established protocols for royal event coverage. Cameras focused on the senior royals, capturing their reactions to the Archbishop's words, their interactions with visiting dignitaries, and the careful choreography of their movements throughout the ceremony. The editing decisions made by the broadcast directors reflected the palace's guidance about which family members should receive primary focus and which should be accorded less prominence. In his private study at Clarence House that evening, Charles reviewed footage of the service with the kind of analytical attention he brought to all significant royal events. He studied the camera angles, noted the public's reaction to various moments, and assessed whether the overall impression conveyed the messages about continuity and stability that the monarchy needed to project. The absence of Camilla's children from the coverage was exactly what he had intended, but seeing it realized so completely gave him no satisfaction. The emotional cost of his decision was becoming more apparent with each passing week. During quiet moments between official engagements, Charles found himself remembering conversations with Tom about literature and food, discussions with Laura about art and architecture that had enriched his understanding of subjects he was passionate about. Their exclusion from royal life meant the loss of these personal connections that had added warmth and spontaneity to the often formal atmosphere of palace gatherings. Camilla's response to the Commonwealth Day service was more complicated than she had anticipated. She had prepared herself mentally for the emotional challenge of attending major family events without her children, but the reality proved more difficult than she had expected. Throughout the service, she found herself automatically scanning the congregation for familiar faces that were no longer there, instinctively saving interesting observations to share with Tom and Laura before remembering that they were no longer part of these experiences. The weeks following the Commonwealth Day service brought a series of smaller, but equally significant adjustments to royal family protocols. State dinners were planned without consideration for Tom and Laura's attendance. Garden parties proceeded without their names on guest lists that had once routinely included them. The careful balance of family and official guests that had characterized royal entertaining during the early years of Charles and Camilla's marriage was systematically recalibrated to reflect new priorities and exclusions. Tom Parker Bowles attempted to maintain his professional routine despite the personal upheaval caused by his changing relationship with the royal family. His restaurant reviews continued to appear in their usual publications, his cookbook projects proceeded according to schedule, and his television appearances maintained their characteristic blend of expertise and accessibility. But friends and colleagues noticed subtle changes in his demeanor, a new guardedness when discussing his family, a tendency to change the subject when conversations touched on royal events or celebrations. The professional impact of his altered status was not immediately apparent, but gradually became more noticeable. Restaurant owners who had once hoped for royal patronage through their association with Tom's reviews began to adjust their expectations. Publishers who had been interested in his projects partly because of his family connections started to reassess the commercial potential of his work. The careful separation between his professional identity and his family relationships, which he had maintained for years, required constant vigilance and strategic communication. Laura Lopez faced similar challenges in her role as an art curator and gallery director. Her professional reputation had been built on expertise and connections within the art world that existed independently of her royal family status. But that status had provided subtle advantages that were now being withdrawn. Gallery openings that might have attracted royal attendance now proceeded without that possibility. Art collectors who had been interested in her exhibitions partly because of her family connections began to engage with her work on purely professional terms. The adjustment was particularly difficult because neither Tom nor Laura had ever actively exploited their royal connections for professional advantage. They had both worked diligently to establish themselves in their chosen fields through merit rather than family influence. The gradual withdrawal of royal association felt like a punishment for something they had never done rather than a natural consequence of institutional priorities. Palace staff who had worked closely with Camilla's children found themselves navigating an increasingly complex emotional landscape. Private secretaries who had coordinated security arrangements and travel schedules for extended family members had to adjust their responsibilities and protocols. Household staff who had grown fond of Tom and Laura's children, Camilla's grandchildren, found themselves editing their interactions to avoid creating awkward situations or inappropriate expectations. The ripple effects extended to the broader social circles that had formed around royal family life. Country house weekends that had once included Tom and Laura as a matter of course now proceeded without them. Charity events that had benefited from their attendance found themselves adjusting their guest lists and fundraising strategies. The intricate network of social relationships that surrounded the monarchy began to reconfigure itself around new realities about access and inclusion. Meanwhile, the media coverage of royal family events began to reflect these changes in subtle but noticeable ways. Royal correspondents who had once routinely included references to the Queen Consort's children in their coverage found less material to work with. Photography from official events showed a more streamlined royal family presence that aligned with Charles's vision of a focused, efficient monarchy, but eliminated the warmth and relatability that had come from including Camilla's extended family. The palace press office developed new strategies for handling inquiries about the reduced visibility of Tom and Laura at royal events. Official responses emphasized their successful independent careers and busy professional schedules while carefully avoiding any suggestion that their absence was the result of deliberate exclusion. The skill required to maintain this narrative without appearing to mislead journalists or the public tested the diplomatic abilities of even the most experienced royal communications professionals. Charles himself struggled with moments of doubt about the wisdom of his decision, particularly during private family moments when the absence of Tom and Laura was most apparent. Family dinners at Highgrove or quiet weekends at Balmoral, occasions that had once brought together the blended family he and Camilla had worked to create, now felt incomplete. The laughter and conversation that Tom and Laura had contributed to these gatherings was irreplaceable, and its absence created a different dynamic that felt less spontaneous and more constrained. But these personal doubts had to be weighed against the institutional responsibilities that dominated his thinking. The monarchy was facing unprecedented challenges in maintaining public support and relevance. Every decision about family inclusion or exclusion carried potential consequences for the crown's reputation and effectiveness. The counsel he received from constitutional experts, political advisors, and fellow monarchs consistently reinforced the importance of maintaining clear boundaries around the royal family's official composition. Camilla's adaptation to these changes required enormous emotional discipline and political sophistication. She had to continue performing her royal duties with enthusiasm and grace while processing the grief of watching her children be systematically excluded from the life she had built with Charles. Her public appearances maintained their characteristic warmth and accessibility, but those closest to her noticed the effort required to sustain this performance while managing her private disappointment. The transformation was not just personal, but institutional, reflecting broader questions about the monarchy's role in contemporary British society. The decision to exclude Tom and Laura represented more than a family disagreement. It symbolized fundamental questions about how royal families should be structured, how hereditary institutions should adapt to changing social expectations, and what sacrifices were acceptable in service of institutional survival. As autumn turned to winter and the first Christmas season under the new arrangement approached, the full emotional impact of Charles's decision began to manifest itself in ways that would test every relationship within the royal family. The silence that had characterized the initial announcement of new protocols was about to be broken by the reality of major family celebrations proceeding without family members who had once been central to those traditions. The palace, with its centuries of experience managing family dramas within the context of public duty, prepared for another chapter in the long history of personal sacrifice demanded by royal life. But for the individuals caught within this institutional machinery, the approach of traditional family celebrations without traditional family unity represented a test of emotional endurance that would challenge even their considerable reserves of resilience and diplomatic skill. The approaching Christmas season of 2023 brought unprecedented tension to the royal household as decades-old traditions collided with newly established protocols. The festive preparations at Sandringham, usually a time of family unity and celebration, became a complex exercise in diplomatic navigation as staff worked to organize celebrations that would acknowledge the altered family dynamics while maintaining the appearance of seasonal harmony. Mrs. Angela Kelly, who had served as the late Queen's personal dresser and now assisted with household arrangements, found herself reviewing guest bedroom assignments that told the story of familial reorganization more clearly than any official announcement. The rooms that Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez had occupied during previous Christmas celebrations remained empty, their absence a silent testament to decisions made in palace offices far from the Norfolk estate's festive atmosphere. Charles spent long hours walking through Sandringham's extensive grounds, accompanied only by his protection officers, and the weight of decisions that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The estate, purchased by his great-great-grandfather in 1862, held memories of Christmas celebrations spanning more than a century. Every room, every corridor, every garden path carried echoes of family gatherings that had survived world wars, constitutional crises, and personal tragedies. Now he was adding his own chapter to this history, one marked by deliberate exclusion rather than inclusive celebration. The king's daily routine during this period revealed the extent to which his decision was affecting his personal well-being. Staff members noticed that his usual enthusiasm for reviewing Christmas arrangements had been replaced by a more mechanical attention to details. His conversations about holiday traditions lacked their usual warmth, focusing instead on logistics and protocol requirements. Even his beloved hobby of watercolor painting, usually a source of relaxation during stressful periods, seemed to provide little comfort. Camilla's response to the approaching Christmas season was particularly complex because it required her to balance her roles as queen consort, wife, and mother in ways that often seemed incompatible. Her public appearances maintained their characteristic grace and enthusiasm, but close observers noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. The spontaneous joy that had once characterized her interactions with children during Christmas visits to hospitals and community centers now seemed more controlled, more carefully managed. The emotional challenge was compounded by the practical reality of maintaining relationships with her grandchildren, Tom's children Lola and Frederick, and Laura's daughter Eliza, and twin sons Gus and Louis. These young people had grown accustomed to spending Christmas holidays at royal residences, participating in traditions like the Christmas Eve present opening and Boxing Day shoots that had become integral parts of their family experience. Their exclusion from these celebrations represented not just a loss of tradition, but a fundamental alteration in their understanding of their place within their grandmother's new life. Tom Parker Bowles attempted to create alternative Christmas traditions for his family, organizing celebrations that would provide his children with meaningful experiences while acknowledging the changed circumstances of their relationship with the royal family. He arranged a Christmas holiday in Scotland, staying at a country house that offered outdoor activities and family time without the complexities that had come to surround royal gatherings. But the effort to create new traditions could not entirely mask the sense of loss that pervaded these arrangements. The professional demands of Tom's career provided some distraction from personal disappointments, but even these activities carried reminders of his altered status. Christmas restaurant reviews, usually a highlight of his annual writing schedule, proceeded without the subtle anticipation that royal connections had once brought to his work. Restaurant owners who had hoped for royal patronage through association with his reviews adjusted their expectations, recognizing that these professional relationships now existed in a different context. Laura Lopez channeled her emotional energy into organizing a major exhibition for the new year, focusing on contemporary British artists whose work explored themes of family, tradition, and social change. The irony of curating an exhibition about family dynamics while experiencing the dissolution of her own family's traditional structures was not lost on her, but the professional challenge provided a constructive outlet for feelings that had few other appropriate expressions. The art world, with its complex network of social and professional relationships, had always provided Laura with an identity independent of her family connections. But the subtle withdrawal of royal association still created ripple effects in her professional life. Gallery openings that might have attracted royal attendance now proceeded on purely artistic merit, requiring different strategies for attracting collectors and generating publicity for the artists she represented. Palace staff faced their own challenges in implementing the new protocols while maintaining the seasonal traditions that had defined royal Christmas celebrations for generations. the head chef had to adjust meal planning for family gatherings that would include fewer participants. The gift coordination staff had to revise their careful tracking systems that ensured appropriate presence for all family members. Most poignantly, the staff responsible for arranging family photographs had to develop new compositions that would appear natural while excluding family members who had once been integral parts of these annual traditions. The media coverage of royal Christmas preparations reflected the palace's careful management of public perceptions about family unity and seasonal celebration. Royal correspondents reported on traditional activities like Christmas tree decoration and carol services while carefully avoiding references to absent family members. The skill required to maintain this narrative without raising questions about notable absences tested the abilities of even the most experienced royal communications professionals. Behind the scenes, however, the emotional cost of maintaining these public appearances was becoming increasingly apparent to those who worked most closely with the royal family. Private secretaries noticed changes in both Charles and Camilla's interactions with staff, a new formality that suggested they were working harder to maintain professional composure while managing personal disappointment. The Christmas Eve service at St. Mary Magdalene Church, traditionally attended by the entire royal family, became a particularly poignant symbol of the changed family dynamics. The walk from Sandringham House to the church, usually a festive procession that included multiple generations of royals, proceeded with a notably smaller group. The absence of Tom, Laura, and their children was not officially acknowledged, but the visual impact of their missing presence was apparent to anyone familiar with previous year's photographs and television coverage. Archbishop Justin Welby's Christmas sermon, delivered to a congregation that included the King and Queen Consort along with other senior royals, touched on themes of forgiveness, family bonds, and the challenges of maintaining love in difficult circumstances. While his words were carefully chosen to avoid direct reference to any specific family situations, those who knew the context of recent palace decisions could detect layers of meaning in his message about the importance of healing and reconciliation. The traditional Christmas lunch at Sandringham proceeded according to protocols that had been refined over decades, but the family dynamics around the table reflected new realities about inclusion and hierarchy. Conversations that might once have included Tom's wit and Laura's insights about art and culture now unfolded without these familiar contributions. The empty chairs, while not physically present, seemed to occupy psychological space in the family gathering. Charles found himself struggling with moments of regret during these family celebrations, particularly when he noticed Camilla's careful efforts to maintain cheerfulness while processing her own disappointment. Her grace under pressure reminded him of the personal costs of the institutional decisions he had made, costs that extended beyond his own emotional comfort to encompass the well-being of the woman he loved and the children who had become part of his extended family through their marriage. The Boxing Day activities, traditionally a time for informal family interaction and outdoor pursuits, proceeded with adjusted guest lists and modified arrangements. The shoot, usually a highlight of the seasonal celebrations, included fewer participants and generated less of the easy camaraderie that had characterized previous years. Even the traditional Boxing Day walk, photographed for public consumption, showed a more streamlined royal party that aligned with Charles's vision of a focused monarchy, but eliminated some of the warmth and relatability that had come from including extended family members. As the Christmas season drew to a close and the royal family prepared to return to their official duties in the new year, the full impact of the summer's decisions became clear. The holiday celebrations had proceeded successfully from a protocol standpoint, maintaining appropriate dignity and traditional observances. But they had also demonstrated the human cost of institutional priorities, showing how decisions made in palace offices could reshape the most intimate and meaningful family traditions. The silence that had characterized the initial implementation of new family protocols had been maintained throughout the Christmas season, but it was a silence filled with unspoken acknowledgments of loss and change. The palace, with its centuries of experience managing personal drama within public roles, had absorbed another family transformation with characteristic discretion and efficiency. For Charles and Camilla, the seasonal celebrations marked a turning point in their understanding of what their marriage would require in terms of personal sacrifice and institutional loyalty. The love that had sustained them through decades of public scrutiny and criticism would now have to accommodate a new reality about the boundaries between family affection and royal duty. The approaching new year would test their ability to maintain their relationship while honoring the institutional commitments that had reshaped their family dynamics in ways that could not be easily undone. The dawn of 2024 brought no resolution to the tensions that had transformed the royal household, but rather a deepening understanding of the permanent nature of the changes that had been implemented. As Charles and Camilla returned to their official duties following the Christmas break, the reality of their altered family dynamics settled into the established rhythms of royal life, like sediment in still water, largely invisible to outside observers, but fundamentally changing the substance beneath the surface. The first major test of the new arrangements came with the planning for Camilla's birthday celebration in July 2024. Traditionally, milestone birthdays for senior royals were marked with both private family gatherings and public celebrations that showcased family unity and continuity. The arrangements for Camilla's 77th birthday would need to reflect the careful balance between personal celebration and institutional protocol that now governed all royal family events. Sir Clive Alderton found himself orchestrating these celebrations with particular sensitivity to the emotional undercurrents that would influence every decision about guest lists and ceremonial arrangements. The private celebration at Clarence House would proceed without Tom and Laura, marking the first of Camilla's birthdays since her marriage to Charles that would not include her children among the invited guests. The public celebration, a garden party at Buckingham Palace, would similarly reflect the streamlined approach to family inclusion that had become the new standard. Camilla approached her birthday with the kind of dignified acceptance that had characterized her public persona throughout her years in royal life. She had learned to find satisfaction in the official aspects of her role, the charitable work, the ceremonial duties, the opportunity to serve causes she cared about, while privately mourning the personal costs of her elevated status. Her birthday would be celebrated by thousands of people who admired her service and dedication, but it would lack the intimate family joy that birthdays had once provided. The months leading up to the birthday celebration revealed the extent to which the royal household had adapted to its new protocols while maintaining the appearance of seamless tradition. Staff members had developed refined skills in organizing events that appeared to include all appropriate family members, while carefully excluding those who no longer qualified for inclusion. The art of diplomatic celebration had reached new levels of sophistication as the palace machinery learned to function according to revised parameters. Tom Parker Bowles marked his mother's birthday by sending private congratulations and continuing his professional work with the kind of dignified discretion that had always characterized his approach to royal family connections. His restaurant reviews continued to appear in their regular publications, his cookbook projects proceeded according to schedule, and his television appearances maintained their characteristic blend of expertise and accessibility. But friends and colleagues noticed that he had developed an even more careful approach to discussing his family relationships, editing conversations to avoid creating awkward moments or unwelcome questions. The professional consequences of his altered status continued to evolve throughout 2024. Publishers who had been interested in his projects partly because of his family connections reassessed their commercial expectations. Restaurant owners who had hoped for subtle royal endorsement through their association with his reviews adjusted their marketing strategies. The careful separation between his professional identity and his family relationships required constant vigilance and strategic communication that added new layers of complexity to his career management. Laura Lopez channeled her energy into expanding her role as a curator and gallery director, developing exhibitions that explored themes of identity, family, and social change with particular resonance given her own experiences. Her professional reputation continued to grow within art circles that valued her expertise and judgment independent of any royal associations. The Contemporary Art Society, where she served as a co-director, benefited from her increased focus on professional responsibilities that provided meaningful work during a period of personal adjustment. The gradual withdrawal of royal association created opportunities as well as challenges for Laura's career. Gallery openings and art events now proceeded on purely professional terms, allowing her to build relationships with collectors and artists based entirely on shared interests in contemporary art rather than curiosity about royal family connections. The authenticity of these professional relationships provided some compensation for the personal losses she had experienced. Meanwhile, the grandchildren, Tom's children Lola and Frederick, and Laura's daughter Eliza, and twins Gus and Louis, found themselves navigating an increasingly complex relationship with their grandmother's royal life. Family visits to Camilla now took place in private settings that maintained their personal relationships while acknowledging the changed protocol around their participation in royal events. These young people, who had once taken for granted their peripheral but real connection to royal traditions, learned to understand that their family relationships existed in a different sphere from their grandmother's official duties. The emotional intelligence required of these children and teenagers was remarkable, as they learned to maintain loving relationships with Camilla while understanding that their royal connections were now limited to private rather than public contexts. Their adaptation to these circumstances demonstrated resilience and maturity that impressed even the palace staff who observed their graceful handling of a difficult situation. Charles himself continued to wrestle with the personal costs of his institutional decisions, particularly during private moments when the absence of Tom and Laura was most apparent. His daily routines at Clarence House and Highgrove, once enriched by interactions with Camilla's children, now proceeded without these familiar presences. The intellectual stimulation he had derived from conversations with Tom about literature and food, and discussions with Laura about art and architecture, was irreplaceable, and its absence created a palpable sense of loss. But these personal regrets had to be measured against the broader success of his reign during its crucial early period. Public opinion polls showed strong support for his approach to monarchical duties, with particular appreciation for what was perceived as a more focused and efficient royal family structure. Constitutional experts praised the clarity of succession arrangements and the reduced potential for confusion about roles and responsibilities within the royal household. The media coverage of royal events throughout 2024 reflected the success of the palace's strategy for managing public perceptions about family dynamics. Royal correspondents reported on official duties and ceremonial occasions with their usual attention to detail and protocol, but found fewer opportunities to explore the kind of extended family dynamics that had once provided material for feature stories and human interest coverage. The streamlined royal family presence aligned with contemporary preferences for efficiency and purpose over traditional pageantry. International observers, particularly those from other European monarchies that had faced similar challenges of family modernization, noted the British royal family's successful navigation of complex personal and institutional pressures. The Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian models of focused royal families had provided useful precedents, but the British approach demonstrated particular sophistication in maintaining tradition while adapting to contemporary expectations about institutional efficiency and public service. As 2024 progressed toward its conclusion, the palace began planning for the annual cycle of events that would mark Charles's second full year as monarch. The protocols that had been established during the traumatic period of adjustment were now embedded in the normal operations of the royal household. Staff members who had initially struggled with implementing exclusionary policies had developed professional competence in managing events that reflected new realities about family inclusion and hierarchy. The Christmas season of 2024 approached with less emotional turbulence than the previous year, not because the family relationships had been repaired, but because everyone involved had developed greater skill in managing their expectations and responses. The celebrations would proceed according to established protocols that acknowledged changed family dynamics without dwelling on the personal costs of institutional priorities. Camilla's adaptation to her role as queen consort had reached a new level of sophistication and effectiveness, driven partly by her need to find meaningful satisfaction in official duties while processing the grief of altered family relationships. Her charity work expanded to include new causes that benefited from her increased attention and energy. Her ceremonial duties were performed with enhanced grace and authority that reflected her growing comfort with the demands of her position. The public appearances she made with Charles demonstrated a partnership that had been strengthened rather than weakened by the challenges they had faced together. Their shared understanding of the sacrifices required by royal duty created a deeper bond between them, even as it required them to maintain distance from family members who had once been integral parts of their shared life. As the year drew to its close, the transformation of the royal family structure appeared complete. The decisions made during the difficult months of 2023 had been implemented with characteristic palace efficiency and discretion. The personal costs had been absorbed by individuals who understood that service to the crown required sacrifices that extended beyond their own comfort to encompass the well-being of people they loved. The silence that had characterized this transformation was not the silence of resolution, but rather the silence of acceptance. The royal family had demonstrated once again its capacity to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the essential traditions and protocols that defined its role in British national life. The price of this adaptation had been measured in personal relationships and family bonds, but the institution had emerged stronger and more focused on its core mission of service and continuity. The story of King Charles's refusal of Camilla's family had become part of the longer narrative of royal sacrifice and duty that stretched back through centuries of British history. Each generation of royals faced decisions that tested their ability to balance personal happiness with institutional responsibility, and this generation had passed that test while adding their own chapter to the complex story of love, duty, and the price of power that defined life within the British monarchy. In the quiet moments between official engagements, when Charles and Camilla found themselves alone in the private apartments that had become their refuge from public scrutiny, they carried the weight of these decisions with the dignity and grace that royal life had taught them to maintain under all circumstances. Their love for each other had survived this test, but it had been forever changed by the understanding that even the most intimate family bonds must sometimes yield to the larger demands of serving the crown and the nation that looked to them for stability, continuity, and hope. Outside the study windows, London continued its daily rhythm, unaware that a conversation was taking place that would reshape the dynamics of the royal family forever. Tourists gathered at the palace gates, hoping for a glimpse of royalty, completely unaware that behind the facade of unity and tradition, difficult choices were being made that would echo through generations. The implications of Charles's decision extended far beyond the immediate family circle. Palace staff who had grown fond of Tom and Laura found themselves having to adjust protocols and guest lists. Security arrangements that had been carefully developed to protect Camilla's children would need to be scaled back. Most significantly, the narrative of the royal family as a blended, modern unit that had emerged after Charles and Camilla's marriage would need to be quietly, but definitively altered. As the conversation drew to its painful conclusion, both Charles and Camilla understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The easy familiarity of family gatherings, the simple pleasure of watching Tom's children grow up within the extended royal circle, the pride in Laura's professional achievements shared within the family context, all of this would now exist in a different sphere, separate from the official life of the monarchy. The chilling silence that settled over the room was not just the absence of words, but the presence of a new reality that would require both of them to recalibrate their understanding of what family meant within the context of royal duty. The palace, with its centuries of history and tradition, had claimed another sacrifice in service of its continued survival and relevance. In the days that followed this conversation, the machinery of the palace began its careful work of implementing the king's decision. Invitations that might have been extended were quietly withdrawn. Future guest lists were revised to reflect new protocols. The official photographers received subtle guidance about the composition of family portraits. All of this happened with the discretion and efficiency that had characterized royal household management for generations. But beneath the surface of professional competence, the human cost of the decision began to manifest itself in ways both large and small. Camilla found herself editing her conversation more carefully, knowing that casual references to her children's lives might create awkward moments or unwelcome questions. Charles noticed the subtle change in his wife's demeanor, the slight withdrawal that suggested she was processing grief even as she continued to fulfill her royal duties with unfailing dedication. The story of this decision would eventually leak beyond the palace walls, as royal stories always do, but the immediate aftermath was characterized by the kind of dignified silence that the monarchy had perfected over centuries of managing personal drama within public roles. The true test would come in the weeks and months ahead, as the family learned to navigate their new reality, and the public began to notice the absence of figures who had once been regular features in royal family photographs and gatherings.